Pim De Witte, OpenAI offered 500 million for your startup Metal TV. What made you walk away?
So can't comment obviously specifically on OpenAI or any of the negotiations with OpenAI. With that said, broadly, the reason why labs, why we chose not to join any of the frontier labs is because we originally thought that a lot of data was going to be valuable for building world models. And by world models, what we mean is these generative models that can sort of predict frames based on actions that are getting input by the user. Um, and we then realized that two things. One, I think the games industry was at a very real risk of sort of getting threatened by these types of systems, and we wanted to keep games weird, so we wanted to sort of build our own lab. And the second is we realized that we were really the only place that had this amount of data in order to do this, so we wanted to just take a jab at representing the games industry, but building frontier systems from the games industry as opposed to those that will try to replace them.
Okay, not the answer I was hoping for, but I'll take it. So tell me about general intuition.
What were you
So
hoping for?
last,
What was the
yeah,
answer you were hoping for?
well, I was hoping for an insane scoop. It was an argument. You fought, and then you said, "Sam, fuck off. I'm gonna build a competitor. They're gonna take down your company." so,
Yeah, I'll leave those details
so
to the imagination. Yeah.
okay, so that could have happened, but because you can't comment, we don't know. But let's talk about general intuition. So last week, it was in the news that you raised $134 million in seed funding to accelerate the development of spatially aware artificial intelligent agents. I feel dumb even reading this. My question is, are you yet another AI founder with a goal of replacing game developers?
So first, we try to build video games, right? And we also are our platform is a part of the games industry, and so we have firsthand noticed the impact of things like TikTok and YouTube, like eating away the attention going into games firsthand, right? And how hard it is to launch games nowadays. Um, and so for us, the things that get us excited is building systems for game developers that let them ship more interesting games. So sort of being part of the systems that game studios are building through like really, really intelligent players and NPCs and tooling, as opposed to building systems that try to sort of replace the game engine or developer or like coding agents and replace developers or artists as a whole. For us, like what I told my team coming in, and the reason why I'm doing this personally is I've grown up on video games my whole life. I have Tourette's. I grew up basically games was sort of my safe space. I wasn't really like it was the place where I could just be myself and not feel like I was at a disadvantage. And so my personal motivation is I want to keep gaming weird. Like I think it's the one place on the internet where people can where like it isn't everything big tech corporations feeding you, very specific videos according to very specific algorithms. It's like the one last like creative weird place on the internet that felt more like the forums that we were all hanging out on when we were kids. And I think that's what makes it so special. I do also think that there's a very real chance of the industry being, at risk of being sort of swept up as collateral damage in this AI wave. And so we felt like we were one of the few companies that sort of had this data and the research capacity and I think the energy to be able to pull something like this off. So we just went for it.
And what should game companies be afraid of?
Yeah, I think the biggest narrative in the industry right now is whether or not world models replace engines, and I think that's kind of besides the point. I think that's actually I think people sort of look at this as a true or false question, whereas I think it's much more nuanced than this. I think it is likely that on a 5-year horizon, we see sort of traditional engine and game distributions be heavily impacted by generative models, period. And over a 5-year period, I think we very likely see sort of these deterministic pieces of the engine, especially the ones that don't need to necessarily have deterministic systems, like player dialogue and things like that. I think these inevitably are affected. I think the big debate is whether or it's going to be modules of the engine that get replaced one by one, whether it's the whole engine as a whole, and then which parts of the engine, and then where to invest versus where to like which engines do you use nowadays, sort of considering that information. And so I think that's currently a lot of the dialogue is on what's going to happen to the engine, and then also what's going to happen to IP, right? Like I think what's going to happen to is it even worth investing in tons of IP if it just gets ripped off into video models super quickly, or right, and how and if it's so easy to create lots of IP, right? Like where do you position as a games company developing this type of IP, and how do you develop it? Do you develop it using these models, or do you develop it outside of using these models? And so I think that's where so that's I think from a technical perspective. I think also people are just like really scared because I think a lot of people don't understand these models, and also even if you do understand, I think a lot of people are just very worried about like what might happen to my job, right? And so I think yeah, that's the majority of what I'm hearing. So my hope today is that we can sort of go into each of these one by one. I've worked in the games industry, I've built games, I've also now have had a few years to work on the frontier of AI, and so my hope today is that we sort of just dive really deep into each of these topics. What I told you before is I believe that the people that choose to go on these journeys are deserve to be subject to the highest degree of scrutiny, right? And so by going into the adventure, I deserve to be asked the tough questions that I should have answers for. And so, no limits, go deep. I'll tell you if I can't say something, but I think broadly, I'm excited to go really, really deep on some of these pretty touchy topics.
Okay, I don't know if I can go too deep, but let me ask you this question. So, you talk about commoditized creativity, essentially. And if the creativity becomes commoditized, so anybody can create similar things really, really fast, wouldn't that increase the value of an IP rather than decrease it? Because then if you have the Assassin's Creed and the Rainbow Sixes, they're kind of on top of these commoditized versions of what you made.
I think it depends on where people transact. So if you as the IP holder also control the interface at which the transaction for that value happens, then that is true. However, if you are not in control of that interface, then and you don't find sort of a way to capture that value, then I think it is harder to measure. Now, that's not to say it's not true, right? Like, I don't know the precise math on this, but, it might be true that, let's say Pokemon is not in a specific market and there's a bunch of counterfeit materials in that market. Does that on a net basis increase or decrease the IP value of Pokemon? I don't know, because there's more people engaging with it. I think that's a question that has to be answered, like specifically related to derivative works coming out of coming out of models, and like for instance, another question is like, is it a derivative work, or is it or is it a new work sort of constructed from the principles of the model itself, right? But I think everyone is pretty aligned that if the model spits out something that looks exactly like an existing IP, then therefore, right, anything produced upon that should be considered derivative work. So I think there's also like a big boundary, and I think a lot of people will sort of go for art styles and that sort of that can be sort of considered new works, and not try to sort of mimic the old art styles.
In the game of growth, everyone is looking for that power up. Vibes is exactly that. It's built by industry people, so they actually get the challenges you're dealing with. As a result, they become the fastest growing gamified rewards platform out there. And the results are kind of nuts. With their AI-powered targeting, you're not just buying installs, you're bringing in the right players. And now they've got this new ROAS optimization engine, so your campaigns basically level up automatically. Vibes is built different. It's designed for growth. And I guess you could say it's powered by good vibes. Check out their DOF exclusive case studies by following the link in the description. And go to vybs.co. That's vybs.co. Share your email and join the waitlist list.
Game devs. We know that great gameplay is what players love, but integrating metagame features like challenges, progression, rewards is crucial for retention and monetization. However, coding them is a tedious and time-consuming process. That's why top studios have turned to Hero. Hero provides a complete suite of battle-tested metagame features that are quick to implement, letting you spend more time on the core gameplay experience. Ready to ship fully featured, engaging games? Check out Hero today by clicking the link below.
You mentioned world model several times and engine. So engine, I think everybody understands, that's Unity, that's Epic, two of the biggest one. But what do you mean by world models?
Yeah. So a video model predicts sort of the next frame based on sort of your prompt and a previous frame usually. So it sort of imagines the scenario and then it predicts subsequent frames based on the frames that exist. And so what world models are is, instead of generating from the distribution of a single next frame, it generates from the distribution of all possible future outcomes in that environment, depending on the action that you take. So therefore, the next frame is generated on the fly, as opposed to in a video model, you often get that the next frame is the next most entertaining frame. Whereas in a video model, it actually, or in a world model, or a generative interactive video model is another way of sort of referring to it, is these frames are generated based on the actions that you take, that based on that action, then the environment changes and responds to those actions with observations in the environment. So it has to, the difference is that a world model has to deeply understand the dynamics between actions and observations, whereas a world model has to understand these, whereas a video model only has to be able to predict the next sort of likely subsequent frame based on the previous frames and the prompt.
And you're building specifically world models.
So we are not building world models for public distribution. So we are focused on agents that contain world models, meaning that the agent itself has that same spatial understanding of actions and observations in its environment. But our goal is not to produce sort of video, like generative video models that replace video games. Now, we work on this line of research because it's interesting for agents to have environments to train in, but I suspect that we will instead sort of become customers of world modeling companies and of game developers that have interesting environments. As that, so the team is widely considered like top world modeling researchers. However, our whole bet is that we have so much of this spatial temporal reasoning represented in the data set that we can essentially skip the stage of world modeling and produce these like super capable agents right away. So if you're one of the state-of-the-art labs, what you have to do is you have to build these world models in order to so particularly you want to avoid having somebody have to crash a car in real life. So you want to simulate that happening, right? And you do that using, for instance, a world model. If you are a large company, then actually having a real person do that is like a really, really high cost of data collection, right? Like you never ever want those things to even have to happen. So you simulate them. What we realized is that our data set sort of self-selects into specifically those type of moments, right? That's what you clip. And so our bet is that we can sort of collect all these different moments and turn them into agents that are capable of specifically acting really, really well in those types of observations. So we say that we're working on general agents that are capable of acting in environments that require deep spatial temporal reasoning.
And what kind of talent can build these things? I know, like before you jumped in, you were interviewing researchers. So tell me the type of a talent that is needed, because you'll raise a lot of money assuming to hire this type of a talent.
The lines of research of world modeling and agents that have internal world models are just incredibly similar. So you use the same data source. You use actions and observations as sort of the main data source. And so you can sort of do that two ways. You can either model actions in, sort of observations or frames out, or you can model frames in, actions out, right? And so if you model frames in, actions out, that's essentially an agent. If you model actions in frames out, then that's a world model, right? So and another thing that's really, really helpful, and like why we actively explore this line of research, is because it's incredibly important to visualize the latent representations of what your agent is capable of perceiving and understanding by actually using world modeling techniques. So yeah, so you'll hear us talk a bunch about world models and about like this line of research, but our goal is not to produce like public use world models. If we build them, they're for sort of training our own internal agents.
And is it hard to find this talent that can build these things?
Yeah, there's maybe 50 to 100 people that like deeply understand this space in the world, and I think like 4 of them are working for us, and hopefully a lot more soon.
And probably expensive to hire that talent.
This is the frontier, and so you have to, like that's the league that you're playing in, which is why you have to raise lots of capital. Also every researcher wants access to tons of compute, and so you have to not only budget for pay and equity, you also have to budget for between $10 and $50 million in maybe GPU resources per year per researcher.
Wow.
And so and that's like on the low end, right? Like if you're in the state, or if you're in even like larger labs, you may even get more of that. So we just have to be very deliberate about the compute that you give access to. And so I think that's why we have a small team. We're very sort of cognizant of the type of bets that we take. So it's really fun, right? Like you really get to push the frontier in a way that no one else has done. But it is just the only reason why we were able to take this bet is because we had such a valuable company, right? And so it's just, that's also why it tends to be big companies that do these things. And that's why the game industry has such a large issue getting started in it, because the amount of capex required to pull this off means you have to be able to convince investors that you can win on the global stage, not just in the gaming stage, right? And so that's what it took for us. And I think so for us, the excitement is that the fact that we are sort of like a homegrown gaming team, in many ways the underdog, I think, against all the big labs, but going up, hopefully representing the home team as opposed to trying to go against it.
And did the fact that you had access to almost unlimited amount of gaming clips, was that the one that was driving the valuation of the company?
Yeah, so the data is really unique, and then it's a team. I think for us, there just aren't a lot of talent-dense teams like this in the industry, period. Like I said, there's like 50 to 100 people that really get this. And we have a good chunk of those. And then I think the other thing that was exciting is that the fact that the Metal's already profitable. And it's despite sort of the PC games industry probably not doing like great in the last few years, right? Like we've grown consistently like 50% plus year over year, profitably, and so for us, it was both a bet on the core business, the data, and the team.
Can you talk about the strategic risk if you're not adopting, or not even adopting, if you're not integrating AI early enough into your processes and in your ways of making, well, in this case, games?
So you have to believe that at this point, the train's leaving the station. I don't think that there is a rational way of reasoning against AI progress at this point. I think you can be you can be selective about where you want that progress to be and how you want to sort of act as an industry and as a society on each of those axes. But I think it's inevitable that like trains leaving the station, and this is like a really big shift for people, right? It's like, honestly, this is the reason why I got so interested. Like I'm a programmer originally. For me, this was like, what's my skill set? Like, what's my value going to be, right? And so that was like a big part of my original exploration of the space. And so I think there's a huge risk in not acting early. Like the biggest cost is the opportunity cost, because you need to start developing these muscles early on inside your company. And I think if you are a talent working at any of these companies, like the best thing to do is just to deeply start understanding these systems and where they are applicable and where the limitations are, and then also understanding where they are scaling so quickly, right? Because it's really easy to like dismiss an AI system based on, oh, it can't do XYZ, and then the next 6 months later it can, right? And so I think building a good understanding, and then because that also helps you understand where to invest, right? And so like I'll give you one example, right? So the reason why we're going after general agents for environments that require deep spatial temporal reasoning is because text is fundamentally a method that we invented as humans to describe what we had before, which was like 3-dimensional geometry and objects in our environment, right? So like by definition, text came after, right? And so we then used text to basically explain what we were observing in a way that required like less bandwidth, essentially, right? So we could communicate danger and things like that very, very quickly. And so text is a compression method, and in that compression, you lose a lot of information. You lose information related to what things look like. You lose like what you are truly perceiving, and you're basically generalizing to a word that as a society you've agreed to best describes that piece of information. Now, that is a massively lossy information event, right? And so our bet is that it's really, really hard to recover that from language models, which is why we're focused on training and perception, right? And so the bet for us is that because text has just had such a difficult time generalizing to areas that have this sort of spatial temporal reasoning requirements, that's why like most agents nowadays still suck, right? That's the bet, that like the unique insight that really like that was underneath our sort of breakthroughs and models and fundraising and being able to recruit people, right? So finding that high conviction area of what you believe and sort of focusing on that is important. And I think also getting really, really good at prompting, I think, is just a must, and building the systems to like there's so many things that people don't like doing themselves, right? Like if you're a product manager and you're looking for a specific user issue, do you really want to go and browse manually through 50,000 tickets, or do you just want to have sort of some form of really, really smart agent that goes and pulls relevant information for you? Probably the latter, right? And so I think you have to just look at like, at the end of the day, if something can be done faster and better, it will be done faster and better. That's what capitalism fundamentally is, right? So it doesn't work to like, get in the way of that. What helps more is just how do you shape that, and like how do you, become, I think, much more effective and like interesting as a result of like these new systems being available, right? And I think that starts with like prompting and like deeply understanding them.
So would it be correct to say that in order for not to be replaced by AI, you have to learn how to use AI and be really good at it? That makes sense, to be honest. And then when you learn how it's being used, where it's effective, where it's less effective, how it's evolving, you are constantly on the edge and being able to be more productive. So in the end, it's about better, cheaper, faster, right? Those three things come together, and that's the that's when capitalism is winning.
The capitalism piece is really important here because that's the system we live in, right? And so at the end of the day, that's the incentive game, right? That the train is leaving the station on AI progress, right? We live, at least for me, and in a largely capitalistic society, which means you have to assume that's kind of where the trends are going, right? And I think there's nuanced discussions to be had about where you should and should not use AI systems, but the default is in that direction, right? And I think that's sort of how to think about it.
How should we think about how games are being built in the future?
So a fundamentally good part of game design is stochasticity and unexpected, sort of introducing variance into the game loop, right? So like in Clash Royale, right, the randomization of the deck, I think this is one of the things that you've pointed out in one of your articles before. So like the fact that these things in video games, they already drive retention, right? So basically having to respond as a player to things that are unexpected in the environment is already a fundamental driver of retention in video games. And so I think LLMs and AI models in general are very, very good at this type of behavior because they are not deterministic systems, right? So I think fundamentally investing in introducing more sort of variance and unexpectedness within the narrative, obviously still into the game loops, was I think one of the first applications. And so This might be that you just might have more objects in the environment that like behave unexpectedly. Where I think as games, we are fundamentally competing with TikTok, and we are fundamentally competing with YouTube, right? And so what you notice about these is they get better, and the meta in these platforms shifts every year to like better editing styles and right like faster cuts between scenes. And you know, like better thumbnail optimization and things like that. And I think as what games is going to happen is it's going to trend more towards less deterministic game loops that introduce sort of more variants per loop. And by the way, those variants can be people, right? It can be like multiplayer games, right? Like the more recent horror games. Like I think it's all, you know, it's all about this unexpectedness. And so that's the main thing. In terms of how they're built, I think I sort of categorize it in these ways. So first, I think LLMs are going to be superpowers for game engines, right? You already see with a lot of the newer engines that they are fundamentally accessible as tool calls to LLMs, right? You see Unity going this direction, Epic going this direction with Unreal. And so also these LLMs are also very much investing in having tool calls and internal representations of three-dimensional structures, which is why they get so much better at simulating video games every year, right? Which is why you can go and, you know, generate a 3JS example environment of something that looks like pretty close to a game. And so I suspect that the development cycles, both creating new games will become 10 times easier, but then also the amount of slop introduced into new games that then needs to get cleaned up when they work is going to be much harder. So I still think that there is like a massive market for specialized, great engineers who understand how optimizations work and engines work. If anything, that's going to explode, I think, because there's going to be so many people that are going to put out AI slop that's going to basically catch on, because it's about the iteration speed through what people want, right? And I think so it's going to be great. It's kind of like having a bunch of these hit moments of having published something that people want, but then if you need to scale it into an actual business, you need experts that deeply understand from first principles how these systems work, right? And so I expect LLMs to largely drive the experimentation of game loops versus like the full end-to-end game development. Then I think inside game development cycles themselves, I think just, you know, if you know what you're doing, LLMs are a superpower, right? There's a bit of issues with languages and engines that are less represented in public data sets, right? And so it might just not work for you as well in those. But I think if your engine has lots of open source projects and documentation, and like these LLMs tend to work really well. And so for speed of development, you know, it's going to speed up. And I think companies have to invest in native tool calls for their companies to, you know, that the LLMs can call for document retrieval on like how to do specific things. I need to invest in things like RAG, right? Where you basically have a central brain behind like how do we write code at this company. It can also be through a set of shared prompts. But I think on the development cycle, really, you know, it's going to be a massive accelerant. On the 3D, so the most interesting part, in my opinion, is the 3D engine portion. So again, this question of what do world models replace? Where do traditional engines sit? How does that happen? So a few things. I think a lot of what makes games great is the fact that these engines are deterministic, right? So the fact that you know that the opposing player has the exact same constraints. Like if you're playing Rocket League and your opponent might see a different size car with, you know, like even though you're trying to match like a similar size box, right? Then that's unfair, right? So I think the determinism of video games, especially in competitive, is a feature, not a bug. And so I think we first start seeing world models and generative media start getting explored in more single-player, story-based games. It's all about like maybe as a new genre, like creative exploration of ideas. On world modeling versus engines. So I think first you have to accept that billions of dollars are getting poured into world models, and that's like more than the entire industry in the games industry is investing into their engines, right? So this will happen. This is not a should not, like this is happening. And so world models are, however, built for very different incentives. So world models are built for simulating initially from a single player perspective, so from the observer, i.e. humanoid robot, or a different type of embodiment, a specific situation that needs to resemble the real world, right? And so they're not that interested in simulating video games inside world models. It's really like, because the whole point is getting access to hard to access environments in the real world, right? And so the likelihood of engines themselves sort of in the near term, like them focused on being able to reproduce really good video games with inside world models, I think it's, and then also solving for the distribution aspect of it, because you have to stream these frames, which is more expensive. Then you have to figure out the economics, right? The cycle that we've built, where you sort of package a build, distribute it, have people pay for it. Steam subsidizes bandwidth, you can make it free, right? All these systems, they've been built and they exist for a very good reason. So I think world models end up existing and accelerating, but not necessarily in the direction of the games industry to start with. Now, however, fundamentally, what these things are doing is they are essentially compressing representations of space through the frames and time, so the temporal, like the sequences of those frames, into a set of actions, right? Which is kind of like a weird thing to imagine. They're essentially super compressors of spatial temporal information and geometry and dynamics, right? And so what this means is that most likely a lot of the things that we're doing deterministically inside game engines is just bloat, right? They can likely be compressed to a like higher order set of generations that doesn't need to be deterministic. Like if you're simulating wind or something like that, right? You might just get a better performance if you actually have it generated by something like diffusion or a work model. So is it on like a direct collision path? Are we gonna see these, like, Elon claims AI generated games by the end of the year that are like workable in the end? In the architecture of a world model, which is what I just described, unlikely. I think in the architecture of being able to quickly iterate through really interesting games with LLMs, more interesting, but that's still going to be tied into the distribution channels that we as a games industry have already built, right? And so, however, long term, because it is fundamentally that compression mechanism, and so at the end of the day, you're not going to need a lot of the engine anymore, I think, as a result of the fact that these things are just hypercompressors of information. So I think, right, long term, the likelihood, and that's why I say 5 years, right, the likelihood of these sequences just being streamed and then your actions being streamed back and then responding, I think, is just the most likely outcome, because having a gigabyte or 10 gigabytes of downloading space when this can be compressed to the actions that you're taking, it's just not viable, right? Because the games industry has a barrier to access problem. We have a barrier to access problem compared to TikTok. We have a barrier to access problem compared to like Roblox even, right? Because people can just switch between different games. And so I think the world modeling architectures and the truths that are underneath are fundamentally solves to the issues of the games industry. So I think short-term collision path, no. Long-term, there is a integration path, and we should be taking it very, very seriously. And so I think long-term games do get built like this, right? And in the short term, I think, so short-term bet really, really heavily on LLMs and their ability to generate like better spatial temporal environments and representations thereof. Bet on like your current multiplayer stack, right? Your current networking, all these things. And then in the very long term, right, become experts at what world models are, what they do. Maybe try swapping some of your engine models with some generative modules and become really, really good at understanding where that bridge is. And then when it's going to be possible to truly generate something inside a world model. Maybe one final comment, multiplayer inside world models is still largely unsolved. There have been a few papers that kind of explore it, where you sort of pair actions and observations from multiple perspectives, but really, really, any form of multiplayer interactions inside of these models is just not there, right? And the scaling laws are completely unclear, right? And so I think that is not going to replace, especially multiplayer video games, anytime soon.
In the game of growth, everyone is looking for that power up. Vibes is exactly that. It's built by industry people, so they actually get the challenges you're dealing with. As a result, they become the fastest growing gamified rewards platform out there. And the results are kind of nuts. With their AI-powered targeting, you're not just buying installs, you're bringing in the right players. And now they've got this new ROAS optimization engine, so your campaigns basically level up automatically. Vibes is built different. It's designed for growth. And I guess you could say it's powered by good vibes. Check out their DOF exclusive case studies by following the link in the description. And go to vybs.co. That's vybs.co. Share your email and join the waitlist list.
So if I would describe it, it goes from a scripted system that we essentially have now towards a generative system where we're heading with an LLMs towards an agentic system with world models, right?
I think that's right. And in the meantime, you see gradually little bits and pieces getting replaced where there's the most incentive to replace it, i.e., super bloated textures that should be rendered by small models on the fly with the same quality because it's just compressing, right?
What is the role of a let's say a game designer as we see it with AI? How would that actually look like? Is it a co-design or co-play or fully autonomous world? Like, what does it look like?
So I love this question because game design is fundamentally, I think, the highest level of human intelligence. It's basically, it is fundamentally something that, like, you have to not only be great at reasoning for is this enjoyable for me, but like how do other humans perceive this particular design elements, and so the ability to design worlds and design environments is almost like a like metacognition test for an AGI system, right? And so because if you can design, right, for instance, and a lot of, and to be clear, a lot of the labs are focused on this. And the reason why they're focused on this is because if you can design a great game for a human, you can design a great test for an agent, right? The same way that we design games to have humans achieve very specific objectives inside those games, you want to be able to train agents to be able to have very specific behaviors, for example, using reinforcement learning or reinforcement fine-tuning on these base models, right? Which is why there's such a large increase in spend behind RL environments right now, right? So these things, like, this is kind of hitting at the most interesting, I think, frontier of so research is going in this direction, and so that means I think game designers can generally expect a lot of tools in order to make game design easier, because especially through LLMs, because they are so focused on this for their broader AGI goals, right? And so that said, it also means that it is very much like coding, a direct focus for a lot of labs, right? And so that means that you have to learn how to use these tools in order to design even better games, right? More, but I think a lot of game design is LLMs tend to be great at spitting out a lot of complexity. A lot of game design is about finding the most simplest expressions and whys of the different loops and then building around those, right? And so I think as humans, we're really, really good at taking lots of information and reducing it to only the things that are absolutely necessary for the game to work, right? And to ship the V1 of it to you want these systems, right? And then you sort of hypothesize through different versions of that. LLMs are not capable currently of having that level of reasoning around sequencing, of rolling out of different experiments, gameplay loops. And so I think a lot of the jobs of game design is going to be taking all this ideation from LLMs and just reducing it to an even more powerful set of primitives, right? And also, because it is now going to be slightly easier in order to produce these systems, I think we can take bets that we couldn't take before. Also, introducing things like LLMs into the environment, right, where you might have to manipulate certain NPCs to get certain things, right? Or where you might have to like what we're doing, right, is beat an object or a player that's like at a top human level, right? In order to get something, just changes how you design in general, right? And so our goal is to sort of move the act of game designing to the level where you actually have sort of human level intelligence to sprinkle throughout the environment, such that you can take fundamentally new bets that you cannot take today. As for how it's going to change, I think it's going to be much simpler to take bets on experimentation of ideas as a game designer without needing to rely on tons of engineers, right? So if you're trying to validate a game idea or a loop, maybe run some Facebook ads, right? Like try, whether mechanics are sticky and things like that. I think that just becomes 10 times easier. And so I think the act of game design fundamentally is going to be the most important job at any of these companies. And it's going to extend to both designing for agents, models, and humans.
So game designers would be more like world creators rather than
world creators. Exactly.
Okay. And would you argue that games are the best simulation layer for developing general intelligence?
Are the best simulation layer for developing general intelligence? No. Text is also great. Text is great, right? Because, like, for instance, there's not a lot of math represented in video games. There's not a lot of like knowledge of, right? So humans, right? We had this, we had games before we had language, right? And so is it an important piece? Yes. Is it, in order to surpass sort of human knowledge, the most critical piece? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be yes, because you need the combination of the two, right? You need text because we invented text, which then led to the invention of many types of sciences that we wouldn't have been able to get without having that common layer of understanding. But are games where humans go to really like exert their intelligence at the highest level? Absolutely, right? So, and is it the best representation of like spatial temporal reasoning, which then is again an unlock for deeper text workflows? Yes. Take for example, AlphaFold, which Demis Hassabis won a Nobel Prize for, and I think a few other participants, and DeepMind, and I think a lot of that inspiration came from a game called Fold It, where amateur biologists essentially learned how to fold proteins, right? And so, and these weren't expert biologists; they were just sort of, responding to what made sense for that particular environment. And so games, I think what they have the tendency to do is they merge all the modalities that exist that agents might. So they merge text, right? Because there might be text elements on the screen. They merge geometry and sort of spatial representations of objects. And then they merge the actions that you take as a human in relation to that. And then what they also do is, like for instance, let's say that you're training off a video on the internet. In order to learn from a human in that environment, you also have to understand what information that human had access to when they made that decision, right? So let's say you look through, you have to know what is in their view to understand whether it was even possible to pick up that cup, right? And so this is why we say we train in perception, because like when you play video games, you have a full sort of view of the information available when a decision is made. And if you are, doing a YouTube video, holding up your phone, and then you're trying to learn from like a person picking up a can in the distance, that is a very, very different set of primitives to learn from, right? Because it's not in perception. You have to sort of estimate what information was available that then was going to lead to that next action. And so games are the perfect merge, I would say. They're the perfect merge of all the modalities, which is why we focus on creating these foundation models with games, because then you can sort of extend out into going deeper into text. You can extend out into, right, maybe more complex scientific problems that include spatial temporal reasoning and text, like what the DeepMind team did with AlphaFold, right? And so that's the dream. The dream is a general agent for environments that require deep spatial temporal reasoning, and that then develops with all the other modalities that we've invented as humans to create general intelligence.
I'd like to say I understood more than half of it, but that would be lying. But let me ask you this, a very simple question. What type of a studio do you have to be really good at adopting AI into your different process? Can you be an existing studio with existing process? You've been doing games for 25 years or 10 years or 15 years, or is a company that is sort of what you call an AI native at an advantage?
Yeah. Pros and cons, right? Like EA, for instance, they have built up this massive moat of like tons of like, I think they bought a company focused on like volumetric data collection, right? Where you have like really, really good environment data on real world physical 3D environments. And so it's completely situational to where you're at. Like you have different moats. I think that, in general, are you better off starting a code base from scratch using AI? I would say probably not, because LMs aren't that great yet at like generating great code bases from scratch that like other people want to work in, right? So actually having these like guardrails of like how your code base works, and sort of having this like, it's almost like labeling, right? Of like it's almost like preference labeling essentially. So I think I don't think the advantage is that big. Where it is larger is if you're in maybe like a really old engine that LLMs don't have great representations of, like if you have a closed source engine, or if you, because then the speed up will sort of not be there as much, right? Because the amount of correct code that it will generate will be wrong a lot more times. And so in addition to, so I think it is definitely a question of like, what is the engine stack that you invest in? I am of the belief that I think open source will see like a large acceleration. Like also Unreal Engine, for instance, has a bunch of their code just openly available, so I think it will benefit them too. But the more open these engines are, I think the faster they'll accelerate, because the more intelligence can sort of be let loose on them, right? And then you have a number of human curators that are saying this is good and this is bad. And so I think it's definitely time to evaluate your stack and whether you're sort of ready for this wave of innovation. But at the same time, doesn't mean you have to throw everything out and start over. No. I do think that, if you're sort of in the late stages of the game, and is your game more likely to succeed if you introduce like novel elements that include these like more stochastic or like non-deterministic systems, then I would also say yes. Right. And if you are at risk of not being able to ship your game and you need to generate a bunch of art to make your deadline or something like that, then like also the answer is like probably yes. Right. I think obviously if the art you generate is like unique and doesn't look like other things, so it's completely situational. I think it's about who is using the tools, not about the tools themselves, and whether you're tastefully using them. And but I can't think of a single example where sort of it would be a net negative in order to just like go all in on using them very aggressively.
That's a very positive thing to hear, because like oftentimes we get to hear that the reason why you're not succeeding or not gaining the full effect of AI tools is because you're not AI native. But what you're essentially saying is that the studios that have built their process are actually at an advantage if they adopt AI tools and basically supercharge their existing capabilities.
Yeah. It's the beauty of these tools is they are truly general tools, meaning that the likelihood of you being able to find use cases across different systems that are special, that are unique to you, are high. So I think common narrative here might be, restart AI native. I think, that's also, I think, obviously what people want others to hear, or maybe it makes them sound better because they are AI native. But the reality is, like, the best studios that I've seen, they just use both, right? They use the best of both worlds. They use the best of AI tooling, then they use the best of like deterministic engines. Like they built on the shoulders of giants in terms of the simulation stacks and the multiplayer abilities that have already been built. They use cloud deployments, right? And so, I think it is about finding what works for you, the type of game you're trying to create, story you're trying to tell, the people it's for, and then just finding where it applies.
Oftentimes when we work with a bunch of different companies, like one of the key questions from the CEOs is usually around AI and what other companies are doing, what kind of process, what kind of tools they're using. And personally, I haven't seen any kind of a secret sauce. And the question has been more about anxiety, that somebody is beating you with some secret sauce that you just haven't figured out. My question is like, is there such a secret sauce? Are some companies just that much better in integrating AI tools, or everybody who is welcoming AI tools on the same level at the moment?
No, I think there's definitely tiers. There's also tiers of labs that care deeply about the games industry and are making sure that tooling includes like lots of engines, right? I think they're pretty public about this, but like DeepMind has made massive investments into different types of simulation engines, for example. And so the sort of engine nativeness and simulation nativeness of the different labs and the taste they have when it comes to the tooling they develop, and therefore I think the capabilities and how well they work inside of video games and different engines, there is a massive spectrum, right? I think I would argue the Gemini models are likely the best, and I think will continue to be the best for this. When you're looking on the LLM side, I know Elon is making like a large push with XAI in this direction. I don't know the specifics of where OpenAI is at the moment with this type of stuff, but yeah, I think there's a massive difference in even skill and approach between all the big labs, and I think there's the reason why they feel similar, I think, is because not every task requires the sort of expert knowledge of each of the models to come out. So it might seem that they're similar, but if you actually push it to the max in like actually generating like physics accurate simulations or like things like that, you do start noticing the difference. Also, with tool calls for like specific applications, you do start noticing the difference. And so I think you have to find where the limitations are for the types of models that you're trying to use. And then the other thing is you have to just get really good at prompting, because prompting is really a way for you to access the parts of the model, right, that were specifically designed or trained with the data that sort of you want the representation to be generated from, in a way, right? So like you might sit in like a more general part of the model with very basic prompts, but like with very, very specific specialized prompts, for specific engines or workflows, you might unlock like a very specific set of activations that just work beautifully for what you're trying to do. And the magic of that is prompting. So I think prompting is truly the skill to develop on like how to unlock the generations that are going to move the needle for you. And then probably also per model learning how to prompt, because it's quite specific for each model, given that they're also designed differently.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful, it's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they'll interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
Attention app and game developers, are you ready to unlock the secrets behind the world's top performing apps and games? With Sensor Tower, you get the ultimate competitive edge, whether it's breaking into new markets, fine-tuning your UA strategies, or boosting monetization. Dive into data like never before, track global trends across app stores, analyze market-leading in-app purchase and in-app ad strategies, and benchmark your performance with real-time insight. The best part, Sensor Tower doesn't just deliver data, it helps you turn it into action. With intuitive tools and expert analysis, it's everything you need to make smarter, faster decisions. Thousands of app and game studios, from indie creators to global giants, trust Sensor Tower to help them win. So why not you? Start your free trial today at sensortower.com. That is sensortower.com.
If we zoom out from AI labs and into a broader, let's say broader economy, most of the market has been driven pretty much by AI now, the growth of the market, especially the growth of GDP of the US. And it feels like there's a little bit of a paradox. If this all ends well in short span of time, we're not talking about a decade or 5 years, but let's say in a couple of years, then there's going to be a lot of unemployed people because the AI models are working just how we expect them to work. And on the other hand, if the AI models prove to be not quite what the investment size have been, and the returns are not quite there, or if there's let's say a shock that comes to the AI system, there's only one chip company in the world, and that exists on a specific island, for example. If there's some kind of a shock that makes it that these values are not realized, then we will see sort of a crash of the market. So it feels like in both scenarios, it's not good for the general economy. Or am I totally wrong here?
I think about this a lot. And so I have two views in it. So the first is I have like a gaming specific view, which I'll start with, and then I have like a broader view. So first off, I think that gaming tends to trend, like as people get more productive, right? I think they also tend to have more free time. So I think for the games industry, I actually think we'll see sort of player liquidity and things like that start to increase as a result of this, and therefore jobs and also the amount of games we can build go up. I also think that, like, for instance, the amount of AI slop that's generated from these LLMs that needs to get cleaned up, I don't think anybody actually understands the magnitude of this yet, right? And so I think where there's like jobs lost on one side, I think they are created in the other. Yes, you might have less like experimentation engineers, but more just like deep engine work, right? And so I think so that's one. So I think it's more of initially I think we're going to see more of a shift from one side to the other, and I think the games industry in general, will, assuming we adapt and we win out against like the TikToks and the algorithmic consumption side, I think the industry will do really well. I think we're actually like one of the big winners of this whole shift. As for globally, so a few things. One, so this is just going to also push more people into games, and I think what Roblox and these types of games are showing is that you can also economies also then exist within games. So I think you're going to see the types of jobs that people have also change a lot, right? Like when I was playing RuneScape growing up, there was a massive, market for people producing gold. That it obviously wasn't entirely legal, but at the same time, these jobs existed, right? And so I think as we start seeing more people sort of shift a lot of their time into gaming environments, we also see for the industry, I think we start seeing new types of jobs come up. As for like the impacts on the economy and the world and for people outside of games itself. So I think judgment is still out, but I will obviously recognize that like there is a initial signal towards the fact that it is leading to less junior people getting hired, etc. But I think at the moment, the sort of 5-10 year judgment is still out on whether or not we end up seeing more companies get created, as more smaller companies get created, and as a result, actually having a net positive impact on employment. I think like the way the internet itself did. Like this is broadly, I think, as humans, we've been outsourcing decisions for a very long time, right? And I think actually even before AI, the internet was like the first part of it. Like you have stock systems that decide, which trades to make. You have right, like a lot of these things that used to be human jobs, they now we evolve and they became system jobs. And I think this is obviously a progression of that, a rapid general progression of that. But I think judgment is still out whether or not this is a net positive or a net negative on the long term. On the short term, I think the areas that are definitely affected is less likely for junior people to get hired because it's easier for senior people to hire and manage these like agents than it is to train up employees, and that's something we have to fix. I think it is, and I don't think like there's clear answers for this. I think as a society we're gonna have to just figure out how to deal with this. And at the same time, though, right? Again, we live in a capitalistic system, which means these things they are progressing in this direction, right? And so, I think that a lot of opportunities that we need to start existing for these people is to like make starting companies like 10 times cheaper, 10 times easier, right? These people are now going to have access, if they can afford it, obviously. And for a lot of people, they don't have that privilege. But if they can afford to start a company, they now have, right, great engineers at the cost of nothing. So that opens up a new opportunity. They can create games at like a much lower cost, at like a global internet service person. That's obviously a big shift. And then also I think it has to be recognized that AI also has a massive deflationary force, right? A lot of building companies on the internet and making money is by making things that are available to rich people available to everyone. This is kind of like look at Uber, right? Everyone's private driver, right? A lot of internet companies basically are the jobs that rich people previously had, that they had people do for them. And so AI is the same thing, right? If you can walk into a regional hospital and get the medical advice of a top doctor because this doctor has access to great AI systems, and that's fundamentally great, right? And we should encourage that. So same thing for science, right? You're starting to see the early signs of this. So we're starting to maybe make rapid scientific progress on the back of these, generations of these models. And so fundamentally, you have to believe, and I believe, that this is a net positive for society, while also recognizing that it really, really, really sucks if you're currently coming out of college. I think for me personally, if anybody wants to talk about this, you can email me. I think, I got very, very lucky that I'm like 5 to 10 years past this, into the workforce. But like, I think that, I don't think there's like clear answers for these people. And I think we have to find them. I hope that, that the games, and making games and like, again, keeping games weird sort of offers a place where these people can go to also, forget about that for a bit. And I think that's a thing that makes gaming great, is that everybody kind of doesn't necessarily talk about those things all the time. But there will be very real consequences, and and they have to be accounted for. I don't agree with you that they're all bad. I think they're actually more likely to be good. But the chance of them bad it exists, and we have to figure out how we take care of the younger generations in the countries we live in, because that's like the entire society like depends on that, right?
I mean, you don't want to be well off if the majority is poorly off. That usually ends poorly with the few who are well off. We've seen that throughout the history.
The cost of like goods coming down is also, I think, we have to watch that as a trend. I think if the cost of goods does not come down and employment goes down, it's an even worse outcome. Whereas if the cost of goods like medical care and things like that also goes down, then we have time as a society, I think, to find solutions and adapt.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge change that is ahead of us. And as with any change that comes radically and changes the whole society, it's a risk. So I try to kind of raise that point. But on the long term, of course, we all agree that there's a lot of positive that comes through, as you said, through the deflationary force and giving access to people to resources that they could only dream about before. So Pim, much appreciated for you joining the podcast. I know you're super busy. You probably won't have time to answer emails from college students because you're busy hiring researchers around the world.
I will.
Okay.
I will. Yeah.
All right. So if you're a student and you're worried about your future, email Pim. It's super, super exciting what you're doing. And you're clearly incredibly intelligent and really thought about this in great detail. So looking forward to seeing the models and the tools that your company will be building and releasing in the near future.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Bye.
We're out.
You did it. You made it to the end of the episode. As a fan of the show, it would help us out if you'd subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast service of your choice. Those stars and likes, while a small action on your part, mean a lot to us and help to grow the show. More importantly, are you a member of the Deconstructor of Fun Slack group? If you have 5 years or more of games industry experience, go to deconstructoroffun.com/Slack and apply to join. Join the games industry best professional community filled with peers always willing to lend a hand, or subscribe to our newsletter to get all the latest insights from the Deconstructor of Fun content creators. Thanks for listening.